from top to bottom, at the Democratic level, or excuse me, at the state level in Minnesota, you have a vice president or the vice governor of the state who's from White Earth. Her name is Peggy Flanagan. And in the Army Corps of Engineers, you have the acting assistant secretary of the Army for Civil Works, who is also an indigenous person named Jamie Pinkham. And then also in Biden's cabinet, you have somebody named Deb Haaland. And so we have indigenous representation at all levels, of this particular struggle, who are obviously in communication with the Biden administration, and they are key decision making positions. They could stop this. Peggy Flanagan has come out and opposed the pipeline on a Facebook post, but then went through a line-by-line refutation of Ilhan Omar and Cori Bush and the Line 3 activists, when they were saying there's things such as sex trafficking that they were experiencing at the hands of pipeline workers, that there was these frack outs, all of these things. So, we have to ask ourselves, what's the point of this representation if they're not going to actually do anything? You can't be like the Obama era when he failed to act on Dakota Access Pipeline. He didn't put in measures in place to prevent the Trump administration from fast tracking the approval process. We have to ask, what is really happening? It's as if people with power are saying, actually, we don't have power to change anything. And that's, I just can't believe that.
I mean, that seems to be the MO of this whole era we're in, right? The game now is an explicit climate denial. It's pretending that people can't do better. And it's not just in climate. Obviously, it's in everything now that we are in a Democratic administration, right? We can't have $15 minimum wage because of a parliamentarian. Everything has a built-in kind of an excuse. And it does seem to me that the function of activism right now is primarily to prevent people from slipping back into the malaise that existed during the Obama years, when people seem to be kind of confident. Not everyone, obviously, but a lot of folks seem to be fairly confident that Obama was just doing his level best. So can you give me a picture of what's going on, Nick, with these activists? I mean, you mentioned there's, accusations of sex trafficking. When we were talking about Dakota Access Pipeline years ago, there was, one of the images that really finally gripped the country and made them pay attention were the images of people being blasted with water hoses, people getting really grievously injured because of those kinds of efforts to force them out of the protests. What does it look like now at Line 3?
Yeah, that's a good point, because first of all, and this is information that I'm relaying by talking to and having interviewed people who are on the ground, who've been there in these camps for months on end, who have been arrested, charged with felonies. And, it's important to point out that there have been over 800 arrests at the Line 3 protests. That's more than Standing Rock. I don't know the exact numbers in terms of felony arrests, but I've been told by some of the legal workers that there have been more felony arrests. Things for, like cutting a hole in a fence. A kid I know, he's a young activist. He's from Red Lake. He was charged with 2 felony counts for just cutting a hole in a piece of fabric on a fence. So they're overcharging people. There's been some excellent reporting coming out of The Intercept talking about how the state of Minnesota created an escrow account that Enbridge has been donating to essentially pay overtime for policing. And essentially it's like they're the Pinkertons. It's like they're there, breaking a blockade or a picket line. And I think that's the way we have to think about it in terms of working class struggles. It's they're setting up a picket line and saying, you are destroying our livelihoods and our economy, our wild rice economy, but also our hunting and fishing economy that depends on the water, that depends on the land. And then you have unionized pipeline workers who are crossing that picket line every single day. And we have to frame it that way as a workers' struggle, because they're taking away the livelihoods of indigenous people, not just indigenous people, but anyone who depends on that land. And another aspect to think about is the role that indigenous resistance has played, not just in the Trump era, but also in the Obama era, and now in the Biden era, in terms of challenging carbon infrastructure projects. There's a recent report that came out by the Indigenous Environmental Network that literally quantifies the amount of carbon emissions coming from Canada and the United States that's being challenged by indigenous resistance. And in both countries, respectively, we make up 3% to 1% of the populations, but nonetheless, we account for 25% of challenging 25% of the carbon emissions from both countries. And to put that into perspective, Line 3 itself will be responsible for carbon emissions more so than the entire state of Minnesota, but also it's equivalent to 40 coal-fired power plants. So we have to add that onto Biden's track record to say this is the responsibility of your administration. You have key decision makers appointed within high-level positions who could stop this tomorrow. They could literally write an email and it would end. It would end the destruction of the lands, but it would also end the potential emission of carbon into the atmosphere. And so in that sense, we really have, indigenous people, we've always kind of, the indigenous movement, I don't speak on behalf of the indigenous people, it's very complex, but the indigenous movement, especially those challenging and being the most confrontational, it's not just, it's not just those spectacular images that you're talking about that happened in the Dakota Access Pipeline, but it's a full range of legal tactics, of political tactics, of direct action. And in many ways, the lawsuits that she was mentioning and the litigation that's happening right now is a way to stall these pipelines just as much as it is, to tie one's body to the machinery to stop the construction of it. So it's not just one tactic over the other. It's an array of tactics, and in many ways we're bearing the brunt of it. The White Earth Reservation, the White Earth Nation, is moving forward with the rights of Menomin, and that's the Anishinaabe word for wild rice. And there's been incredible backlash from the right, especially these corporate law firms like Gibson Dunn, who represented Chevron.
Gibson Dunn, I was going to say,
Yeah.
familiar name from our Stephen Donziger episode.
Exactly, and they're not only attacking like the rights of nature movement coming out of indigenous movements, indigenous communities, but they're also attacking things like the Indian Child Welfare Act. In a place like Minnesota, which has some of the highest rates of adoption out of Native children from their families or placing them into foster care systems, you have corporate lawyers from Gibson Dunn showing up to quote, everyday custody hearings. And the reason is that they're trying to bring lawsuits and they're trying to bring cases against tribes to essentially say that protecting Indian child welfare and the prevention of removal of Native children from Native families and Native communities is a form of race-based legislation that is unconstitutional. I don't think that they have the best interests of Native children in mind. I think it's because their ties to the oil and gas industry, that they understand the threat that Native sovereignty in a legal framework of the United States, although it's very weak and very complicated, poses to their energy infrastructure projects.
Yeah, it does really feel like what feels like a ratcheting up in terms of a response to activists, whether it's Stephen Donziger or the whole visceral moment of the double protest. Back in 2016 and how that affected the kind of electoral cycle that year, that it is almost evidence of the efficacy of some of these protest movements, right? That there does really feel like there's a ratcheting up as there's a growing public consensus about the urgency of climate change. And that's scary. And I want to bring Alex in because I know you've talked about some of the moves to criminalize pipeline protests. Can you let us know a little bit about what people are going through and what protesters are up against now?
Yeah, I think this is actually one of the areas where there has been a similarly, glaring dissonance between what the Biden administration has said about its support for certain communities and for climate action and what is actually happening on the ground in states. But in the years following the Dakota Access Pipeline fights, there was a massive proliferation of these bills, most of them nearly identical, all of them largely based on a model legislation that ALEC, the conservative policy shop, wrote up and started shopping around before the Dakota Access Pipeline was even completed. And these bills, more or less, they vary by state and by jurisdiction, but they severely ratchet up the penalties for being involved in any kind of pipeline protest. And these range from certain bills which would levy financial penalties on organizations that are connected to individuals who are caught, you know, doing something as simple as trespassing, doing
Mm,
something as benign as maybe cutting a hole in a fence, or potentially just being on the property when a piece of equipment is damaged.
mm,
And the penalties could, in many cases, absolutely bankrupt churches and religious institutions, small nonprofits, and land individuals in prison for upward of 10, 20 years, depending on the state, facing fines in the tens of thousands of dollars. Minnesota, as this has been unfolding, has repeatedly entertained a bill of its own like this. It has, in each case, been introduced by Republicans. It has generally failed to gain traction, but more than almost 2 dozen other states have actually adopted these, and you saw this wave really, just increase throughout the pandemic. I mean, in the very month in March 2020, when many states were going into lockdown, when many legislative sessions were being cut short, you actually saw 4 states pass these into law. With advocates of all kinds, really obviously crying foul and insisting that this was totally undemocratic and unfair. That couldn't even make their case to legislators. So this is something that, while it hasn't, the worst of it hasn't necessarily come to Minnesota in that specific form. It's something that we're seeing all over the country, and something that I think is having an absolute chilling effect on people as they are making the decision of whether or not they want to go to a place that might land them in prison for 10 years and bankrupt their family.
yeah, I mean, the relationship here between law enforcement and the companies that are pushing for these pipelines and other kinds of energy interventions is scary. And I know that it's something that I heard you talk about, Nick, recently in an interview with Tara Hauska on your excellent podcast, which you should also plug and let our listeners know about. What's going on there, and what can people do to try to help folks who feel as though, even in the course of their protest, they're not just going up against independent, companies, that seems to be an alignment that's happening between law enforcement and these energy companies.
Yeah, one of the things that she brought up in that interview, which you can find if you just Google Red Nation podcast, is how during the George Floyd uprising in 2020, law enforcement was using the kind of strategies in the fusion centers that they had created in preparation for the Line 3 protest to essentially crush and to police and surveil those protests stemming out of Minneapolis, which I found was like a very fascinating kind of connection. But also there were, the training that a lot of these little counties had received. And these are like, this is, I think people have a false image of Minnesota. I do. Like I was like you, I was like, oh, what happened to Minnesota Nice?
Right.
And
Amy
it's like,
told that story so many times about standing in a blizzard that you got me hooked.
for me, like I grew up in South Dakota, but we never went to Minnesota for, I don't know why. But it was a new experience for me just to see the level of like surveillance. There was police helicopters flying over frequently all night. I think what was more terrifying, though, in all honesty, was just the kind of the threat of vigilante violence. Like some of those camps were on main highways at nighttime, and I thought people were honking in support, but I was told later. I was like, no, those guys hate us, and I was like, oh, really?
Yeah.
I just kind of have that naivety. I guess I am a little bit baby down here in New Mexico where there isn't that kind of overt white supremacy, but I think it combines with this new kind of style of policing, where the police, the county sheriff's departments understood the bad press because they were trained by Kyle Kirchmeier, who was the I can't remember the county's name. I think it's Mandan County, or frick, I can't remember his name. It's the county that was the county sheriff that was policing the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, but he was advising and going on like a tour of the nation to help rural law enforcement agencies police pipeline protests led by indigenous people. He did seminars in Montana because they believed that there was going to be an uprising against the Keystone XL pipeline that was going through that area, specifically in the Fort Peck Indian Reservation. So they got this training, and if you notice in a lot of the photos and the videos, with the interactions with the police, of course this isn't across the board, but they're very like friendly, right? They're gonna take, instead of like beating you up and taking you down in 30 minutes, they're gonna spend 16 hours, right, negotiating and having what they call a conflict resolution, but also being culturally sensitive and understanding that there's certain there's certain cultural protocol, like burning sage. We need to let the sage go out before we arrest you and brutalize you. We need to get the elders out first, those kinds of things. So it speaks to the level of police reform and how it doesn't actually change anything. It just, it may change like the behavior of the police, but it doesn't change like what the police actually do, in terms of attacking, profiling, and harassing water protectors in this situation. But that's something that I think we should pay attention to in terms of, and also they recognized, the state of North Dakota recognized that it was bad press to have a company like Tiger Swan, operating there essentially as mercenaries for the pipeline company, and also giving briefings. What
is Tiger Swan?
Yeah, Tiger Swan is a private security company, or was a private security company that was operating and doing intelligence briefings for the kind of array of law enforcement jurisdictions policing the Dakota Access Pipeline, and they are people who cut their teeth in the so-called U.S. global war on terror. They were in Afghanistan. They were in Iraq. So they take that kind of counterinsurgency and counterintelligence tactics that they learned, in sort of a boomerang effect, like Aimé Césaire has said in the past on colonialism, back to the sort of domestic context and policing indigenous led uprisings against fossil fuel infrastructure, and labeling these water protectors as jihadists and things of that nature.
Things of that nature. It does all seem to be one big issue all the time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I want to ask you though, I seem to recall a lot of speculation about whether Amy Klobuchar was going to be a VP pick last summer. And it seemed like the George Floyd uprising and her proximity to it all as a prosecutor in Minnesota ended up being the death knell for her. Although I've also heard murmurings more recently that they think that her time is coming down the pike. Do you think that some of this kind of humane D&I version of a diversity and inclusion police intervention that's going on is partly because there's a sensitivity about what this means for Klobuchar and how this reflects on her politically? And has she said, what has she said about any of this?
Well, there's a really amazing, maybe you can find the clip. There's a really amazing clip where she's confronted by Line 3 protesters who ask her to comment on Line 3 and what's your position? And she just walks away.
Yep. To turn heels.
It's amazing. Yeah. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your speech. And just wanted to mention another issue that's really important to Minnesota, the Line 3 pipeline. Will you be able to call on President? Will you be able to call on President Biden?
Look, we just need to set a trap for Klobuchar. Just put her in a room with a lot of staplers. End of her career. End of her career. Right there.
Hey, YouTube, don't forget this is a podcast. To get full episodes, including ones that are behind a paywall, go to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. To get more episodes, please do subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and like this video.